a sleepless bed, but you're wasting your time trying to lose the blues.
And now we're going to waste some time with Ed Clarke, or as you can see with his little moniker there, Clarke's Latin, which might give you a small insight into what he might be talking about. Ed, how the devil are you?
I'm well, thank you, and surviving the corona apocalypse, I think.
Ed, tell our viewers a bit about yourself. You're a teacher and you're a Latin teacher. Tell me, how did you get to where you are now?
I started out tutoring. That was in fact, just before I went to university, I began doing a spot of tutoring. And I taught in the end all through doing my classics degree at Nottingham. I was up north for university, or at least as up north as I've ever been. So I started teaching then, and then I graduated in 2012, and I taught a couple of years at Cranley at a senior school. But ultimately, I was interested, I suppose, in the prep school level, because it gives you an opportunity to start the language from the very beginning, and to really to get the kids doing what you want them to do, to approach the language in an analytical way and so forth right from the start, rather than picking up off, as it were, where somebody else has left them, if you see what I mean. So I started teaching at Highfield, where I still am in 2014. So I'm still head of classics there, and I have since I've been on the committee which has created the new Common Entrance classics specification. That's for ISEB, the Independent Schools Exam Board. So I've helped to create the new Common Entrance, and in a sense, I've created a whole load of resources in the shape of Clarke's Latin to go with it. I'm also the iaps Classics Advisor. I do their conferences each year. I've done keynote Latin conferences as well, and I've written in the Spectator and the TES and a few other bits and pieces. And I guess I campaign for traditional knowledge-based sort of old school teaching, I would suggest.
And you don't get much more old school than Latin, I suppose. Can you just you threw an acronym at me, an acronym.
Did I?
IAPS.
Oh yes, that's the Independent Association of Prep Schools, which it makes me laugh a little at my old prep school, which was quite all very Evelyn Waugh. I was at Milbourne in the late 90s, and the headmaster was a man called Norman Hale, who was head for 51 years. He went from 1948 to 1999. And I think was in his 80s when I got to the school. So he was quite a formidable character. He once picked me up by the hair because I didn't know the difference between Oro, I beg, and Ora, the shore, which I've subsequently never forgotten. But I think we were thrown out of IAPS in the 90s because he wouldn't allow inspections. And he felt that inspectors were just there to look at the plumbing, and he would escort them from the premises. But I think they've since been welcomed back into the fold.
Is he? I won't ask if he's still there, but
he did retire a couple of years after.
I see. That might be something to do because violence Latin is a certain approach that some people do swear by, of course. Now, this is something I keep saying to people when they ask me about curriculum content, and I say Latin's not for posh people. And I'm suddenly thinking, actually, this interview might be proving the opposite. Is Latin for posh people?
Well, I mean, it's one of the issues, really, that if you wind up being a classicist, more likely than not, you've been privately educated, because unfortunately, the bulk of the Latin and Greek teaching that goes on certainly does tend to be in the private system, and that is a really sad thing. And it's been wonderful seeing groups like Classics for All cropping up and trying to expand it into the state system. I did go and speak at the East London Science School a couple of years ago, and they've got a wonderful classics department, and the kids were very clued up. I gave a talk on ancient history for them. So I think with some of the new academies and free schools and that sort of thing, a degree of classics has come back in. There's been a minor renaissance in recent years, I would suggest. But it is still rather the preserve of the private sector, which is definitely a shame, because there's just so much to offer in its own right and in terms of backing up other subjects as well.
It's an interesting point as well that some state schools are moving towards a classics curriculum, but not going the whole hog with Latin or ancient Greek or doing the language as such. So some bring it in at lunchtime or after school as a sort of club activity. And where does it belong out of interest? Do you think it belongs in a languages department or in a ancient history classics department, perhaps?
A little of both, I suppose. I mean, it's whenever anybody discusses, and I hate this word, cross-curricularity, and the links between various departments. I tend to say that really it's not for Latin to show its links with everything else. It's for everything else to show how it comes from Latin. I mean, so many of the subjects on the curriculum have connections with the ancient world. And I think you always have to proceed on both fronts. I think there was an attitude in years gone by that ancient history or classical civilization was a bit sort of Roman domestic science, and that the languages were the proper stuff. And I'm happy to say that I think these days it's a much more broad business than that. In fact, I'm quite excited that one of the changes we've been able to make with Common Entrance is the introduction of a classical civilization paper, which we didn't have before. There was a little section at the end of Latin on Class Civ, and we've now got it as a subject in its own right. But I think it can sit comfortably in either of those worlds. It's wonderful if people are able to study the language, whether that's, ideally on timetable, but as a club or whatever. Schools do make that work. But equally, it's very much at home with its links to history, and of course our own history in terms of Rome and Britain.
Now, where you do a lot of work for what not in prep schools, but so for in the state sector, sort of primary age and key stage 3, I suppose.
Yeah, our kids sometimes will leave at the end of year 6 and go to senior schools that then start at year 7. But most of our kids will end in year 8 and then start public schools in the beginning of year 9. So yes, we bridge primary and the beginning of secondary, I suppose, which is it's a good age range really for, in terms of the mind being a sponge at that point in time. I think that, once you get into proper teenagerhood, you become a bit of a write-off for between then and A levels. Whereas I think up to the age of 13, they're beginning to get a bit teenagery by the end. But the minds are very good at soaking up information. And I certainly I've benefited hugely from that myself, having gone to a very old-fashioned prep school that was very rigorous academically. So, for example, most of my teaching these days is Latin. I tutor a bit of Greek, but I haven't taught it full-time for many years now, which is a shame, and it means that my Greek sometimes gets a bit rusty. But as soon as I pick it up again, suddenly my mind will go luamai, lue, luatai, luamatha, lueste, luontai, or whatever. It's all there because I learned it at age 11 or 12. I think I will probably end up taking it to the grave. It's all inbuilt. So it's a fun time to teach in that sense, because they really do pick things up and then go on to apply them at senior schools, and we hear nice things back from the senior schools about how they're getting on, which is very rewarding.
Because it is also for teenagers, of course.
Oh, very, very, very much so.
Yeah.
And I mean, indeed, it's funny to think. I mean, I sat my scholarship. I'm now 30, so I sat my scholarship exam for senior school 17 years ago. I can still set the papers from that era. Nothing much has changed in the last 20 years in terms of the standard that's required, which is about AS level, I suppose, for Latin. So it's jolly difficult still. All of those kind of Eton, Westminster, kind of that standard is still very, very high. With, I might add, a fraction of the teaching time that I had when I was a kid. We had a huge amount of Latin on on the timetable, which doesn't tend so much to be the case
No.
these days. So it can be a bit of a challenge, but it's still a very high standard that's reached for us age 13.
Now, you came across, sorry, I came across you recently about the Latin primer that you've put together. Now, when I was at school, I did a year of Latin that was very disappointing in a state school that used to be a grammar school, so a comprehensive, and it all fell apart very quickly. But I remember doing Cambridge Latin, so it was all Caecilius, and I forget the other names. What's your opinion of Cambridge Latin?
I must admit, perhaps reluctantly, to being a skeptic when it comes to the Cambridge Latin course, and it was principally really because of it that I started writing my own resources. I published my first book, Variatio, some years back now, in 2015. I'd written it in my early 20s because I wanted, I guess, the guiding principle of Variatio, and subsequently the books that I've written recently, was that I always wanted the student not only to know what the Latin in question meant, but why. Why is it that Caecilius est in horto, which is the legendary first line of the Cambridge Latin? We all know that it means Caecilius is in the garden, and that's quite self-explanatory. But why does it mean that? And I think it becomes immediately apparent for a bright and perceptive student looking at that phrase will say, okay, well, if I look up horto in the dictionary, I find that the Latin word for garden is a hortus. So why has it got an O on the end of it? Why is it in horto? How would it be different if it were in hortum? Why is the verb est in the middle of the sentence when usually verbs are relegated to the end of a Latin sentence? And you have all of these questions, which I fear go largely unanswered. And I think both of my parents studied with the CLC back in, I suppose, the early 80s for O-level. And both of them found the same thing, that they initially felt very confident about translating Latin. But when it actually came to doing their first O-level unseen translation, completely fell apart because essentially they didn't have the understanding of the workings of the language. So obviously that's a problem when it comes to actually having to translate stuff and knowing what you're talking about. But also, I think there is often a sense in modern education that in order to make something enjoyable, it needs to be simplified. And I think quite often the very opposite is true. Once you attain a certain level in a subject, which I think for Latin is probably about the scholarship level that I get my top students to at prep school, once they've got to subjunctive constructions and some of the harder stuff, they're then able to read some genuine ancient literature. I do a bit of Catullus poetry, some of the PG rated poetry rather than all of the grislier stuff. And I do a bit of Harrius Potter et Philosophy Lapis and bits and pieces like that. So that's when it becomes really enjoyable at that stage. But there's quite a lot of donkey work that you have to do to understand the grammar and to really know what's going on before you get to that point. So I fully accept that the Cambridge course is enjoyable, but bluntly, I don't think it's the best way to get to grips with how the language actually works.
So you sound more like a Neville Gwyn approach.
Yes, I've met Neville, who's delightfully eccentric, and yes, I enjoyed his book that take quite a similar approach to how I approach the subject myself. You're quite right.
But he said, I think, something like you can learn Latin in an afternoon and then the rest of it's practice.
I think I probably would agree with that again. And indeed, the latest course that I've produced, Clarke's Latin, named after, of course, my Twitter handle, is principally designed for that reason, to produce as much practice as is humanly possible. I've created bits of it with computer automation. So it literally has created every possible permutation of the vocab and the grammar that's available. And I think particularly you can hurry up a bit later on down the line. Once you're dealing with scholarship kind of stuff, you can teach something in a lesson and do a passage and move on to the next thing. But in the very beginning, absolutely, you can explain things very quickly. A moa massa mat is 20 minutes worth of explanation. But to be able to do it in your sleep For me to shout out a word and a kid immediately be able to tell me what it means, or to talk about the grammatical terminology, for me to go, what's the second person singular of walk? And someone can say ambulance without having to think about it. That does take hundreds of questions, a very great deal of practice. Just as we do with everything else, really. It always amuses me that the discovery learning is so fated in educational circles when we don't apply it to anything else. You wouldn't learn to ski with discovery learning. Oh, well, see how you get on with that crevasse. Oh, no, that wasn't a very good idea. Or learning to drive, or learning a musical instrument. I remember the violin was my first instrument as a kid, and there's the joy of playing the pieces and so on. An awful lot of scales and arpeggios and practicing and so on, and that's all very important for academic subjects as well as extracurricular stuff like that.
Well, talking around discovery at some point, because if I go into schools and I say teach Latin, it's a great thing to teach, but of course there's not enough Latin teachers out there. So is there a way that me with my 1 year Latin, and that was Cambridge Latin, and Caecilius est in horto is all I remember.
Yeah.
Can I pick up one of your books perhaps and give it a go?
Well, I would very much hope so. And I mean, loath though I am to embark upon a sales pitch for my books, a snip at $11.99 and available from the website. Thank you for aiding and abetting me in that. Yes, I mean, in point of fact, it is a consideration for me at school whether I'm happy to say that our numbers are growing at the moment. And we're expanding in certain year groups to extra sets. So there is a possibility in years to come that I may have to find myself an apprentice amongst our assistant teachers. But certainly, I like to think that the books are very methodical, obviously for the children's benefit, but also I think any adult picking up the language would rattle through the first couple of volumes of Clarke's Latin pretty speedily. And certainly the rudimentary stuff, you're really dealing with OST must disunt, the 6 endings of the present tense, and a few noun cases in the first declension, but it's very limited. And of course, as I'm always talking about with the children, and they find it very interesting, there's so much English etymology that derives from Latin. We've got thousands and thousands of derivations, which are very helpful for remembering all of the vocabulary and that sort of thing. So absolutely, I mean, you'd have no difficulty at all with the rudiments of Latin in this course, and I think that would be true of anybody else. So, I mean, this is something I've heard. I mean, I was chatting not so long ago to the head of one of the really good London free schools, who said exactly that. I'd love to have a classics department, but ultimately, if we get somebody in and then they disappear, we can't replace them and that sort of thing. But I really do believe it is something that you can pick up, and without too great an understanding of the language, you can at the very least teach the basics of it. So I really would encourage that if possible.
So we've almost got round to saying Clarke's Latin for discovery learning if you're a teacher.
Yes, or except that it's not so much discovery as the book telling you everything.
I was being cheeky.
But yes, discovery learning the old-fashioned way, when we used to just call it learning, and a bit of teaching as well.
Now, you mentioned it's got a bit of computer stuff going on there, which is very, very modern, Ed. Very modern for an ancient language. Tell me how that works.
Well, it's funny. I mean, I'm not necessarily the greatest fan of technology in the classroom. It does concern me occasionally that our pupils are turning into cybernetic beings, are constantly attached to an iPad, and suffer withdrawal symptoms if the iPad is removed. But I'm by no means a Luddite, and I think technology can be transformational, and certainly it has been in this case. I mean, I've been able to produce Clarke's Latin in about a year and a half, quite a lot of it during lockdown, to try and keep myself sane. And have something to focus on. I had a very monk-like existence, sublimating my emotions and writing thousands of words of Latin prose. But now I've lost my trail of thought. What was the question? Oh, computers. Yeah. It's actually, slightly surprisingly, it's through Microsoft Excel. It may not quite be up to scratch when it comes to looking after the nation's coronavirus data, where you run out of columns. But actually, I mean, Excel is an extraordinary program, and particularly in its latest iteration, it has significant powers for essentially recognizing and then automatically completing patterns. On a very basic level, if I've got a list of vocabulary and I want to take that vocabulary and add a particular ending onto it, if I have the vocab and all of the endings in 2 columns in Excel and begin typing, it combines the two for you. And I must confess, I discovered it quite by accident when doing dictionaries or something like that for a booklet I was doing for some of the kids. And suddenly the computer did it all for me. I couldn't believe it. It really has been life-changing, because actually producing resources, and particularly producing more complex sentences, can be very, very time-consuming. And the original Variatio books, which are 2 quite slim volumes, took 2.5, 3 years to do. So it really has been an amazing development, being able to do stuff through the computer, and indeed create the books themselves on the computer as well. So I've had to get quite tech savvy for it all.
So if it wasn't for COVID, then we wouldn't have all these wonderful resources online.
No, I mean, for what has been a grim old situation, it was, from my perspective, the one silver lining. I mean, we did carry on teaching throughout. So I was working 9 to 5, but I didn't have the usual Saturday school or evening duties and that sort of thing. So I had a little bit more time on my hands. So I tried to treat it as an extended sabbatical. I mean, I think I'd written the first 2 books by the time lockdown hit, but 3, 4, and 5 I've done entirely in lockdown, and I wasn't expecting to have them done until 2021. So it has been fortuitous in that regard, though I certainly wouldn't wish to experience it again.
Yeah. And how's your school coping with COVID generally?
I think really very well. I mean, I feel very sorry for our senior management, who I'm sure haven't had a moment's peace all year. I mean, the government guidance was resent and reappeared and updated every 5 minutes in quite radical fashion. So I think they've had a major job on their hands. But no, we carried on teaching in much the same way, really, over the internet, which I must admit was more effective than I had expected. I was a bit skeptical about the Zoom teaching. It's obviously not a patch on the real thing, but we were able to get quite a lot done. And interestingly, in the case of our year 8s, who, unlike GCSE and A-level, common entrance did go ahead, which I think we were very grateful for, really, because it gave the children a goal to aim for, if you like, and kept them on the right track. And if anything, I think their results were better this year than they have otherwise been, because they were at home sans distraction, and there was perhaps a greater degree of focus on their revision and that sort of thing than ordinarily there would be with all of the extracurricular goings on and so forth. So I think we've actually coped very well. And it's been interesting as well to see, I think, across the private school system, that actually our numbers are up this year. I think because, I mean, essentially, you have to keep on teaching or people won't pay the fees and will extricate their children from the school. So there's very much been an impetus in the private sector to carry on business as usual. And I think that has attracted some people into the sector who are concerned that, I mean, before this vaccination news came out, it was looking like we'd be in lockdown until 2034 or something, and actually children are missing out on a key time in their education. So we've seen quite a significant boost to our numbers, and I think that's the case elsewhere across the sector. So kind of a surprising result, really.
Yeah. And I think there's also an increase in homeschooling and all sorts of things for various different reasons, perhaps. But there's certainly a change. A change is a coming because of this to lots of parts of society, perhaps.
Indeed.
So there's also something else I know about you, and that's you do impressions. Tell me about Tell me about
Well,
your impression.
I started doing stand-up comedy, and I remain available for weddings, bar mitzvahs, funerals, etc. Way back in my school days, really, and I learnt comedy songs principally. So I'm a bit of a musician as well. So I used to do Tom Lehrer and Monty Python and Flanders and Swan and that sort of thing. And I suddenly got to a point where I had pretty much run out of old material, and I was suddenly forced at the last minute to write my own stuff. And I did the London circuit a bit and stuff like that over the years, and I still do parties occasionally and things. So it was usually political things and comedy songs and that sort of stuff. But I did also develop some impressions. It's such a fool's game, because as soon as you've got the hang of one, they die or disappear from public life, which is very disappointing.
Some of us remember these older characters,
I,
you know.
yeah.
So who've you got?
I
Who've you got?
think my natural voice has always been closest to Roger Moore as the years have gone on. You know,
Go
the
on.
very suave, seductive, sort of, you wanted to see me. I love all of those. The dialogue in those films, in Moonraker and that sort of thing, is such fun. You return, Mr. Bond, with the tedious inevitability of an unloved season. I thought there were no seasons in space. In your case, only winter. So on. And politically, I always loved William Hague, you know, with that lovely round, lugubrious tone, speaking as a former foreign secretary and a former leader of the party. And Ed Miliband, which was pretty much Tony Blair with a speech impediment. So he had Blair's People of Britain, but it then had that strange cleft palate thing with the people of Britain. Look, you know, I say to you, as I was talking to Russell Brand the other day, that terrible thing of repeating people's names. So, look, Martin, that's a very good question. That was a natural way to approach things.
Did you do Margaret Thatcher?
Well, Margaret Thatcher has several voices. There's the very soft, quiet, patronizing tones, almost seductive. But get her annoyed, and goodness me, Arthur Scargill, Law and Order, Falklands War, Nasty People, Unions, Rope Birch Electric Chair. You know, like get quite strident with Maggie. And I always
Go on. Any modern day ones?
That's a very pointed question, Martin. I could.
You're only 30s.
I could do Boris, but everyone can do Boris.
Go on.
No, of course. After Brexit, we're going to have volleyball playing women with very large breasts and curvaceous cucumbers, no longer encumbered by the European Union, and so on. And Nigel Farage is much the same thing, but I think you have to have smoked for a few decades to. They do a wonderful Farage on Dead Ringers. He says, "Hello, I'm Nigel Farage. No, let me speak." Interrupting before anybody else has had a chance to talk. But yes, I really ought to get the hang of some new ones. But I didn't. I could never quite get the hang of Jeremy Corbyn, who again they did wonderfully on Dead Ringers with just that sort of petulant menace. But I'm glad I didn't bother. He's
gone now. He's gone
from the scene. Is now hiding out on the Isle of Wight. I saw the other day.
Well, with a nudist. I
Again, nothing would surprise me in 2020. You know, former leader of the opposition expelled from the party and hanging out with a nudist on the Isle of Wight. That's an ordinary Tuesday afternoon.
Brilliant. Look, Ed, it's been. I could go on all evening listening to you do wonderful impressions and talk about Latin. It's been absolutely fascinating. I wait. Obviously, Clarke's Latin is number one on my list, but number two would be Clarke's impressions. I think, you know.
Well, I will endeavour to create some new material at some point in the way. I mean, now that I've eased off a little with the Clarke's Latin project, I've finally finished all 11 volumes of it. There's 5 parts with their answer books, and there's a batch of papers as well. So I'm giving myself a bit of a rest from Latin book writing. So yes, who knows? I may well put on another one man tour. So
Fantastic. Thank you, Ed.
My pleasure. Thanks, Martin.
Take care.
Behind you can run and hide, but you will find that where you go, the blues go. You may think you're with